Thank you for joining us. This is John, and we're talking valuations. Although, actually, John, I'm going to let you talk to valuations because you wouldn't want me talking about it.
I think we would, actually.
Yeah. What are we talking about there? What do people need to think about? How do you help?
Yeah, so evaluation is paramount to any business, right? So there are a number of reasons why somebody wants a valuation. The most common is going to be when they're looking to buy or sell an entity, right? Oftentimes when you have two people who are coming together, buyer and seller, they're not going to agree on what the business is worth.
That's just typical human nature,
yes,
right?
The buyer's going to say it's worth lower, the seller's going to say it's worth higher. At some point in time, we need to try to come together and find the right price. And so what a valuation does is it takes a look at the historical financial records, it takes a look at industry standards, industry multiples, all of those kind of items, and it tries to the extent possible, kind of create an objective measure of what a firm is worth. Now, there are different ways that you can go about valuing a company, right? Oftentimes when we prepare valuation reports, there's going to be 3 or 4 different types of valuations. We weight them depending upon the industry, and then based on that weighting, that kind of gives us, this is what we believe your entity or business is worth.
Hey, John, just to be clear, do you typically represent the seller or in other words, okay,
yep,
good.
Both. So the good news is, right, again, while human nature would dictate that selling and buying, you would have 2 different values, the reality of the situation is that objectively, it should be the same value either way. It should be based on the entity performance. It should be based on those multiples. And so we'll represent either the buyer or the seller in an effort to get as fair a deal as possible.
Sure.
Right. Now, again, it's never, from a selling perspective, right, it's always a somewhat challenging, or can be a somewhat challenging conversation, because when you build something from scratch, it's your baby, right? Nobody wants to hear their baby's ugly. So if you think it's worth $1 million, we come in and say it's actually only worth about $500,000. That's a difficult conversation to have, often not a very pleasant conversation to have, right? From a buyer's perspective, they're often a little bit more appreciative because they go, oh, great, you might save us some money. However, yeah, it's one of those where we're using objective numbers. We're trying to the extent possible to get all subjectivity out of the calculation.
So sometimes a buyer might be a little unrealistic about what they really need to pay to get that thing.
Yes. Yeah. And conversely, a seller may be a little bit unrealistic in what they're ultimately going to receive.
I mean, about sellers too, because you mentioned it's your baby. I mean, in some businesses, the seller, the owner, may be an integral part of why that is worth it, and if he's going to go away, that's going to change things, right?
It does, and so then
it's tough
to
figure out.
And so then there's a question of what does a transition plan look like, right? So in something like an accounting business, oftentimes the previous owner will stay on for a period of time. 3 to 5 years, where there's a payout associated with whether or not they're there, how long they're there, kind of based on gross revenues, right? But before we can get to that point where we're structuring to ensure that we kind of mitigate that risk, where one person leaves and therefore all the clients are going to follow, something along those lines, we first need to kind of get to, does this make sense? Is this valued appropriately, right? Because the prior owner can say, I'll be here for 20 extra years. But if we can't agree on a price,
doesn't matter. Right.
Right. Yeah. So
a lot to think about.
To think about. And the first step, right? Valuations, they can be and are intensive, right? So oftentimes you'll get folks who do, we'll call it a cash flow valuation, where they're essentially just taking the cash flow for the past couple of years, maybe projecting future cash flows, and they're coming up with a number based on the cash flow. So you'll add back certain things, you'll subtract certain things, and come up with a number, right? It's a very quick way to do it, but it's also not the most scientific way to do it. And so you'll get folks who do that, and then they're surprised when they come get a formal valuation and the number looks very different, right? So yeah, it's one of those where it's always good to have a more formal valuation done, especially as you start talking about larger and larger numbers, just to make sure that there is equity there, or it's equitable between buyer and seller.
So if you're looking to sell your business, or maybe you're looking to buy a business, maybe a good place to start is right here with John.
It's a great place to start.
And what's a typical conversation? So if they give you a call, what do you do in that first meeting with either one of those?
Yeah. So the first step is kind of understanding what you're looking to accomplish, right? Are you looking to buy a business? Are you looking to sell a business? Is it one? Is it multiple? And then we start getting into what are we going to need. So we're going to start with financial records. We're going to start with a questionnaire that kind of helps us understand the business environment, what things look like, and then from there we'll run some numbers. Once we get those numbers, once we get all those financial statements and all that kind of fun, all the stuff everybody loves to talk about, then we'll run our numbers, get the report, finalize the report, and that's what we ultimately will deliver. And then we'll have that conversation. The report will then dictate kind of here's what we value the business at based on this methodology, and from there we go to table, and that's when the attorneys do.
One last question. Obviously, it depends on the industry, but generally, how long does something like that take? They call you today. When are they going to be talking to you about those numbers and the reality?
So ideally within a month, right?
Okay, wow, that's even okay.
Yeah,
good.
But it also depends on how forthcoming they are or how much information they have access to.
I was going to ask you the same thing. Is it a little different between representing the seller because they're sharing everything? Now the buyer, you got to ask the seller for that information.
And so often you have to have, like a buyer and a seller typically have to have some sort of a letter of understanding. The buyer then has to request 5 years, the past 5 years financial statements, tax returns, right? All of that information. Some sellers are okay with that because they're viewing it as a good faith effort to kind of go move on with the transaction. Others start clamming up very quickly because they don't want to provide 5 years. Why is 5 years? Why not 3? Why not 2? What if 5 years ago it wasn't as good of a year, right? And all of that does get weighted, but it is all part of the valuation process. If 5 years ago, the pandemic, for instance, right?
Sure.
Things looked different. So we take that into consideration when we're valuing things, but it still matters, right? All of those years still do have an impact.
And that plays into your final report or what you present.
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay. Yep. Hey, get started right now. Give John a call. What's that number they should call?
440-865-3396.